Dora, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today and being willing to be our first person. You have so much to talk about in such a short period of time. We'll just get started right away. You were 3 years old when World War II came directly to Yugoslavia in the spring of 1941 when it was attacked by Germany. Before we turn to the horrors of the war and the Holocaust, tell us first a little bit about your parents and their life in the pre-war years.
As you noted, I was born in Zagreb, and this is where my parents lived after they married. Before that, my father actually, that family was in Zagreb, what I haven't thought about previously is that they actually came to Zagreb sometime during my father's early teens, I think, and they came from further northeast in Serbia, and my grandfather died there of natural causes. Of course, it was 1932, and was buried there. And this trip of mine just this month included finding and visiting that gravesite, which was quite a thing because none of the family had been able to locate that grave before that. So the family apparently moved to Zagreb and through Bosnia to Zagreb, and this is where my father grew up and eventually ran this small factory of brushes. There is very little that I really know about their life in Zagreb, except that they were a fairly religious family and followed, the usual Orthodox laws and rules. And one of my uncles worked at the Jewish Community Center. So much about that family. My mother's family I know much more about because they lived in this small town of Ludovic where I ended up eventually. And my grandfather and my grandmother came there already with their two youngish, really early teenage children from Slovakia. And they were invited to come because my grandfather was a rabbi, as you mentioned, and there was a Jewish community in Ludovic, not a very large one, but obviously wanting to have a rabbi. And so that's how they ended up in Ludovic. And then after that, they had two more children, my mother being the youngest. So the oldest daughter ended up being 15 years older than my mother, and that sort of played in their relationship.
Your father, as we mentioned, owned a brush-making business,
Yes.
but his avocation was as a cantor.
Right.
And that was related to how he met your mother, I think.
Yeah, I think so, because they all were trained they all had good voices, and they were all trained, all the boys, male members of the family were trained in leading Jewish services. And so that is, I think, how they met when my father came to Ludovic, where my mother had at that point already finished the teacher's college and was teaching in elementary school. Yes.
And your Aunt Giza and Uncle Ludovic, they were essential to your survival, and we'll hear about that. Tell us just a little bit about them and what you know about their early years.
Yes, well, it was very important, yes, in my survival and in life generally in Ludovic. My aunt worked in the local bank, and Ludovic Vrancic was the director of the bank, and it's a small town, and that is how they met, of course. But it was actually a community where there was much mixing of social mixing, and there very interesting photographs of their both being on a tennis team and so on. So they met over and over again, and they fell in love.
And he was not Jewish, right?
Definitely not.
Yep.
He was a member of a long standing, upright, somewhat aristocratic. They were sort of not a high aristocracy, but they were an aristocratic family, and they had many children, all of whom somehow died of one thing or another, except for one very early. So their relationship, the Gizas and Ludovic's relationship was there, but they never married, I suppose, because of the differences of religion, I would imagine. Though when I questioned him after the war, he always said, well, she was happy living with her family, and I was fine living with my mother, so it was okay. I took it with a grain of salt.
Right.
Anyway, by 1939, they knew what was happening in Western Europe, and they decided that they would marry because it was known that it was possible for a non-Jewish member of the family to save the Jewish member of the family, of the one spouse saving the other spouse. And so they went to Hungary to get married. A reason for it, that there was no civil ceremony available in Croatia, but it was available in Hungary. And so they traveled and they married, and this way neither had to convert, and yet the marriage was acknowledged by the government.
When Germany launched its attack on Yugoslavia on April 6, 1941, you were away from Zagreb and on a visit with your relatives in Ludovic. Tell us what you can about the circumstances, as best you know them, caused you to be away from your family, and what happened once the Germans entered Yugoslavia in April of 1941.
Well, so I was born in 1938. By 1941, in January 1941, I was happy to receive my baby brother, and so he was born in January, just like I was, and there was a 3-year difference between us. And I think at that point, soon after his arrival, we had a visit from neighbors from Ludovic and some friends of my grandparents, and they offered to take me to my grandparents to visit. Now, I'm not sure, and I probably never will be, whether it was my mother just saying, well, she needs a little rest from a 3-year-old when she has a baby, or whether they knew something about what was happening. I would imagine that it wasn't planned because of the war, but anyway, I left with these neighbors, and I have a memory of being with them on the train and that being exciting. But that was the last time I saw my parents, so I was 3. So there must have been fairly soon after my brother's birth, because Germany attacked April 6, 1941, and at that point I know I was in Ludovic, because I sort of remember everybody being upset and crying, and it was still cold. I sort of have some
you can remember
sense of that, yes.
Do you know, up until that point, had your parents made efforts to try to leave Yugoslavia?
Not that I know of. I think there was a sense by people that there was really nowhere to go. There was one way of going someplace, and some people managed to go, including my aunt and uncle. They had passes to go. Where? Even though Ustaši, which is this right-wing Nazi followers within Croatia, they ran the government when the war started. They took over and they ran the so-called independent state of Croatia.
But completely a puppet government of the Nazis.
Completely a puppet government. But they did not have all of Croatia. The southern part of Croatia, along the coast, was occupied by Italy. And the Italian zone apparently offered some help to Jews. They were interned, but not in killing camps. They were just sort of sequestered, and kept in a camp, but it was not dangerous. So my aunt and uncle and their two cousins somehow thought that they would go there. Unfortunately, they also were very attached to their home and to the business,
which they had left to go there.
Left, yes, and so they were offered. By the government, there was an offer that anybody that returned would be safe, so they unfortunately returned. It's interesting that very recently, actually going through my papers, I found the passes, which I am about to give to the museum. I found the passes that they had to go, all the four of them, to go to Italy, but obviously they were not used. So.
And they returned home and.
Yeah, so. That's all I know of any possibility of people leaving. I know people who had survived in the Italian zone, and once Italy capitulated, some of them were actually able to go with the Italian forces to Italy and survive in camps there. And some of them went with the partisans into the mountains, and that included an aunt of mine and two of my cousins.
Who went with the partisans. Who
went with the partisans, and they stayed in the mountains, and it was tough and not an easy way to spend the next few years, but in the mountains with very little food and cold and being outdoors and so on. But they made it, and they survived.
And of course, as you were telling us, you were when the Germans occupied, you were in Ludbreg. Your Aunt Giza and your Uncle Ludovic and other family members in Ludbreg, where you were, learned that your parents had been sent to a concentration camp, but that your brother, who was with your parents, of course, had been saved from deportation. Tell us what you can about your parents, what happened, and then what happened to your brother.
My parents were deported quite early. And my brother was still a baby, and they were being held in a transfer camp in Zagreb. It was more like a police organized gathering, and from then on they would be taken to Jasenovac, the camp, the major camp, but. Our housekeeper followed them to this transfer.
As they were being taken there.
As they're being taken. And she asked the police, the Ustaše, if she could have the baby. And my mother handed her the baby with the hope, of course, of saving his life. So then the housekeeper called this uncle of mine in Ludovic in Ludbreg, and he and my Aunt Giza came and got my brother and brought him to Ludbreg. And from then on until the end of the war, we were together.
And I think you told me you actually remember them coming back with your little brother.
I remember them coming back because, you know, I was being very much pampered by everybody, my cousins there. I was much younger than they were, and now all of a sudden there is this baby, and I remember him crying, and I sort of thought, you know, what in the world is this? So I just have a memory of his arrival, and from then on, you know, we were together as the war proceeded. What I probably should have mentioned is about my uncle Ludovic, Ludva we called him. I called him Striček, which actually means uncle in Croatian, in a sort of a diminutive. He was just a very special and unusual person. in that. As I said, he came from this family that was a Catholic family with many children, but he had so many talents. He was a violinist by avocation, and he had a group going which was a chamber music group, and had a choir going and was teaching people how to sing or play, and that played a major role later on for him, and he was really well known in this town, and this is what, of course, enabled him also, because he had this fairly high standing in the community, that enabled him to go and get my brother and get him.
So he was a real pillar of the community.
Yes, he was.
Yet, in 1942, he was arrested, and he was sentenced to Jasenovac's concentration camp, and you and your brother remained with your Aunt Giza. Tell us about your uncle's imprisonment at Jasenovac, and then as a result of that, what happened to you, your brother, and Aunt Giza?
By the time he was sentenced, by the time he left, all the rest of the Jewish population had already gone. They came one day and went down the list and arrested everybody. And I have a fairly vivid memory of their saying goodbye to me. And
of various family members saying
all the
goodbye.
family members, everybody was sort of gathered in Ludovic's house, in his and Giza's house, and people were carrying satchels and pillows and whatever, and crying and saying goodbye, and I was left behind. So that's what happened already before he was deported. What happened? So for a while we were just staying. It was he, Giza, my brother, and I. That was all that was left.
And his wife, your aunt, was somewhat protected at that point.
She was protected, so they didn't pick her up.
Okay.
They didn't pick us up, which of course was a total miracle. Why they didn't pick us up, and. We were in this small town where everybody knew who we were.
Knew who you were, yeah.
Where everybody knew who we were. So the question was, of course, why didn't they pick us up also? Right. And one of the thoughts was that that they didn't have us on the list because there was a list of Jews of that town, and of course we came from Zagreb. We weren't local, in quote. So we were left behind, and Aunt Giza, because she was married to a Catholic. So we were left behind. But there's another thing that was happening around there, and that is that by 1940, by fairly early actually, certainly by 1942 when he was arrested, there was a fairly sizable and getting stronger and stronger partisan force. This was a partisan uprising of people who did not want to be part of the regime. They did not want to serve in the Ustaše army. Ustaše had a fairly strong army, which was now fighting the partisans, and the partisans would then attack and take some of the arms, and this is how they became armed with time.
Right.
And this was like all across Yugoslavia that was going on. And they were led by the communists who were able to sort of organize things. And of course, at that time, we didn't know what communism was, but these were people. But
they were fighting the Nazis.
They were fighting the Nazis, and of course, Russians at that time were fighting the Nazis too. Right. So. Anyway, so at one point, the partisans would be winning, and the Ustaše would get very, they would get livid over the fact that they would be losing battles, and so they thought, well, let's arrest anybody that might have been helping them, and so they came and arrested people who were citizens of Ludbreg, Catholics, all Catholics. There were no Jews left at this point. And they would just, they picked up, well, my uncle, and then they picked up, the fellow who ran a bookstore, anybody, and a number of people, about 5, I think, who were sort of the leading citizens of that town, and sent them to Jasenovac. And as you mentioned, they were given sentences because that was the way the political prisoners were treated.
As opposed to Jews who were not sentenced, they were just sent there.
Jews, yeah. Well, the Ustaše had all the so-called enemies that the Germans had, plus, because they were sending Jews, Roma, and political prisoners, of course, anybody that was connected with the partisans, but also Serbs. And that was one of their major purposes, is to make Croatia what these days we call ethnic cleansing, and they were trying to get all the Serbs out. So in sending these people, the political prisoners, they would give them a sentence, and he had a 10-month sentence, and he found himself in Jasenovac.
And I didn't know of Jasenovac until I met you, and my guess is many people in this room have not heard of Jasenovac either. A notoriously awful place, I've learned from you and others since then.
Yeah. It was one of the most notorious places. It's interesting that people don't know the name Jasenovac, but I so often meet people who ask me where I survived the war. When I tell them where, they said, "Oh, Croatia, that was a terrible place." Mm-hmm. They seem to know without knowing the individual things. But there were about 25 camps within Croatia, within Croatia. Some didn't exist for a long period of time. Some did. Jasenovac was existed for practically the entire war. And it was really brutal. It was definitely a killing camp. They did run things, workshops, and created things that they could use in their functioning or in their war. They were making chains, and there was tanning for some strange reason. But the prisoners were given practically no food. There were the tortures were unbelievable, and people would be just killed out of hand, not in an organized sense. When you think about Auschwitz, where people were numbered and separated in groups and so on, this was a free-for-all of total cruelty. And I was told that by a witness that my grandfather, for example, who was fairly elderly and had had a stroke by the time he got there, he was just hit on the head with a shovel at the entrance to the camp, never made it even in.
Just wanton randoms hit him in the head.
Yeah, random, yeah. My father was definitely there, and he...
And you know that because, your uncle saw him, right?
Yeah, my uncle saw him,
yep.
And he was working very hard and having very little nourishment, but he was young and strong, and he was surviving. My uncle Ludovic would have never survived if he had to do what my father was doing, right. Because he was that much older. As I mentioned, my aunt was 15 years older than my mother, and he was 10 years older.
He was born in 1885.
He was born in 1885, yeah. So, and then he came from this family, what I mentioned, but so many of them had all kinds of lung problems and other health problems, and so he would not have survived if not for the fact that they knew that he was a banker, and they needed somebody with some brain to do their accounting. And so they put him in an office to do some of their work, some of their office work. And that, of course, saved him, because that kept him in a place that wasn't freezing and was out of the elements. And also, they had the desire to be entertained, and they knew that he could put on shows. And so he was told to put on shows. And so he gathered a number of people who were
fellow prisoners,
all prisoners, including actually two of his sort of distant relatives, some nieces of sorts. And he put them together, and they had a choir, and some musicians were put together, and they actually put on shows, and that kept everybody
to entertain the guards.
It would put several hours of again being in a place where they didn't have to carry rocks, and so Jasenovac wasn't built by professionals, and it was not originally some kind of a organized place. So the prisoners actually built much of it too. And of course they dug their own graves too, and it was just an awful place.
And while your uncle's there and your father, as your uncle found out, you were, and your brother, of course, were with your Aunt Giza, but in early 1943, while Ludovic is still in Jasenovac, your Aunt Giza was denounced, and she was deported to Auschwitz. Tell us what you know about what happened to Aunt Giza, and then what happened to you and your brother, who are now without your Aunt Giza.
There was, as I mentioned, the town of Ludovic was incredible because everybody knew who we were, and yet we were not denounced up to that point.
Up to that point.
But at some time at that time, someone fingered her and denounced her, and they came and picked her up. As they were doing that, she was running. There were two buildings next to each other with a big yard all around it, and one of the buildings we lived in, and house, and the other one was unfinished, but it was supposed to have been a two-story building, and the bottom was done. It had an apartment and a store in front. That was my uncle's store, my other aunt. But the upstairs was unfinished, and she was apparently running to hide upstairs, and went with us by the family that was occupying the small apartment, that was renting it from us, the small apartment in the backyard, and that was the Runjak family, and she asked them to take care of us, and left them with us and tried to hide, but they caught her. They caught her, and she ended up in Auschwitz, and we know that. We always sort of knew that. Even my uncle tried to follow the trail and try and save her, because he, in the meantime, just was released.
Almost at the same time.
Almost at the same time. He was released and tried to find her, but he couldn't. And he was told that she went to Auschwitz, but actually I didn't know that for sure until fairly recently, when the large archive from Germany, the Bad Arolsen archive, came to this museum, and I actually have a card that testifies to her having been there, and when she died, supposedly of typhus or some intestinal problems, probably of starvation. Anyway, where were we?
So Ludovic comes back, Giza's gone, his wife is gone, he tries to find her. Now
we are all by ourselves with the Runjak family.
The Runjak family.
Right. And that was a wonderful Catholic family that took us in. It was a very small apartment, and they had 3 children of their own, older than we were, quite a bit older than we were, and we had to pretend that we were their children. Of course, the people in Ludovic knew who we were, but the armed forces that would come, the Ustashi that would come, they actually bivouacked in our backyard. There was like a large...
Literally in your backyard.
Literally in our backyard. They took the space at one point. And so we, of course, had to pretend that we were the Runjak children, and I knew to call Mrs. Runyak Mom anytime that anybody was around.
As young as you were,
As
you knew
young
that.
but I knew. At that point, I was 5, I think, and I knew when to call her mom and when not to call her mom. My brother, who was younger, of course, didn't make any distinction. He learned how to call her mom, and that was it. He called her mom for the rest of the time. So we were with the Runyak family, and often, even before that, we were taken in sometimes by other families within Ludbreg. So a lot of other people had been kind to us,
At one point, you were actually baptized as Catholics.
Yes.
Why was that?
Because there was a local priest who came to Mrs. Runyak, who was a religious Catholic woman, very kind. She ran a trachoma clinic. There was a lot of trachoma, eye problems.
Glaucoma.
People had that. Yeah, not glaucoma, but trachoma, which is a disease, and somehow was rampant there. And so she worked very hard. He was a house painter. It was not any kind of a special family. They were hardworking people, very nice, and the priest came to her and said, "What are we going to do with these children?" Sort of like a veiled threat, they're next. And so they thought that probably would be a good idea to baptize us. And so when my uncle came back, actually, I was baptized, 1944.
1944. You described to me the time in Ludbreg after your uncle Ludovic returned from Jasenovac until the end of the war in May 1945 as a time of constant fighting between the Ustasha and the partisans that were all around Ludbreg where you were. And what was that time like for you? Because you have a lot of memories of that.
I have a lot of memories of that because for a child it was sort of unbelievable. You had to, you would go to sleep in the evening, and then gunfire would start and things would go crazy. Sometimes we were lucky and we were told ahead of time that there would be, or we knew ahead of time, or it started and we thought we had enough time to run to the basement. Now the basement was not an American-style basement, it was a wine cellar, and you had to go outside of the house and then down the stairs to the area that housed giant barrels of wine, and there were shelves with fruits drying and things of that nature, dirt floors, small windows high up, sort of damp. There were frogs jumping around, and we had cuts down there, with set cuts, and there were long periods of time that we slept there because it was a protected area from all the fighting that was going on outside. But sometimes the fighting would start and it would be too late it was too dangerous to go out
outside,
of the house,
go down the cellar, yeah.
So we stayed in the house protected by, there were thick walls. This was an old house built in the 1800s, and there were thick walls, but of course there were windows. And so you would kind of hide in a corner where there were no windows, and there was a time that I was stuck in sort of in a corner where it was safe, but I was afraid, so I was crying, and I called for my uncle, and he came to comfort me from another place, and it was very lucky for all of us because a bullet came through the window and landed exactly where he had been a minute before. So it was terrible because there was a battle when the Ustashi were on one side, and that was actually bivouacked in our yard, and across the way were the partisans, and they were in a second-story house and they were shooting at one another, and we were in the middle of it. And the bullets would go through the windows, and we had these big armoires with sheets and things inside, and bullets would pierce through that. Later on, when you would take out a sheet or a towel, it would be sort of as if a child had taken a napkin, a napkin and made like lace thing.
Because of the holes in it.
Yeah, so the armoires were pierced for the rest of it.
I was struck when you told me that for you, the worst part of the time was living through battles and being afraid of being shot as opposed to being deported and sent away, because that was so tangible and real for you.
Exactly. And it was very tangible because you ended up, in the morning, you would end up looking out to see who was there, and if it were partisans, you were safe. But there were two fairly long periods of time that we were under partisan control. It was okay, but when we were under Ustashi control, I had to. I learned how to pretend that I wasn't who I was, and I would have to wear a hat sometimes if I went outside, because I was a flaming redhead, so was my brother. And that's very unusual in Croatia. There aren't any redheads. And so I would be, not that there was, I would just stand out. Somebody would talk to me, and you didn't want anybody to talk to you.
Didn't want to draw attention to you in any way.
Yeah, and then there were horrible times when the partisans would lose. And I remember very well one time, for some strange reason, one of our, we had someone helping us in the house, because right now we were just my uncle and my brother and I, and we had this woman who was cooking or something, and she decided to go to some movie or something, and she took me with her. And I have this memory of her trying to hold her hand over my eyes, but I could tell what's going on. On that main square, as we had to pass it, there was a partisan hanging off each tree. And so they caught those and they hanged them. But there was also a time when they caught a whole group of partisans in my street, at the very end of the street. They were surrounded, and they were this was actually the leadership of this particular brigade, and they were holed up in a house, and when there was no escape, they threw a bomb among themselves and just committed suicide. So we always knew about that happening, and even as I was growing up, remember going by that house every time I would think about that.
Dora, before we turn to the war's end and a little bit about after the war, two questions. One, did you ever learn subsequently how or who denounced your aunt? Because you had been known who you were in that little tiny town.
Yeah, we did know. His name is Stramšek, and he escaped into Austria after the war.
After the war.
Yeah, we found out who he was, and there was no way of doing anything about it.
Right.
Yeah.
And your uncle, since he had already been arrested earlier by the Ustasha, when the Ustasha took control of Ludbreg on those times that they were in control, do you know why they didn't arrest him and send him back to Jasenovac or do worse to him?
No. It's just one of those things, a miracle of time.
Right.
You just don't know why things, you don't know, there was such uncertainty. Things would happen and you didn't know why or what was going to come next. I have no idea why they wouldn't take him again. Different people, different groups came, and the lucky thing was the town, because nobody then went and said, "Hey guys, there is."
He's still sheltering those Jewish children, yeah.
And now we were Catholic.
Yeah, and now you're Catholic children. Yeah. Dora, with the war's end in May 1945, you're alone with your brother and with your uncle Ludovic. With the end of the war, what did your uncle do then to try to rebuild a life? And now he's got the two of you in his care.
Yeah, well, we had a succession of housekeepers. and that's how life went on. It was difficult post-war period. And this very sad thing that happened is that in 1946, very, very early, my brother contracted scarlet fever and died very, very fast. So at this point was just my uncle.
So he was, what, 5?
Yeah. And yeah, he was born in 41, so. And the other thing is that was happening is you expected somebody to come back. And people would always ask me, are you still, you know, in 1946, 47, people still stop me in the street and say, are you still hoping, people who didn't know me at all, just like out of crazy curiosity, said, are you still hoping that your parents would come back?
They would stop you and ask you that?
Yes, I remember, not very many times, but I do remember being asked that. I think we are now in the communist period.
Right.
Because once the war ended, then the Communist Party took over, and now we have a communist government. Tito, some people remember him, was at the head of it. And so a different order of things. There was a sense that some people had been sent out east in the camps, and that maybe my parents would have been sent to Russia, a la Raoul Wallenberg, for example.
And so they might come back.
Might come back.
Yeah.
I didn't ever think so.
You didn't?
No. And then two of my uncles returned. These were my father's brothers. I'm sorry, one of my father's brother and one of my mother's brother. This is the only person in my mother's family that survived.
This one brother?
One brother. And he came back to Ludovic. Everybody came to Ludovic to see whether anybody there survived. But he then remarried very quickly, another widow whose husband had died, was killed in the war, and 2 children. And they very soon left. By 1948, everybody was leaving to go to Palestine, to Israel.
While they could still leave Yugoslavia.
While they could still leave Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
And the other person who came back was one of my father's brothers. And he came back and he very much wanted me to go with him. There was some difficulty between Striček, my uncle Ludva, and my returning uncles. There were a number of things that were the problem. One of them was that these uncles wanted me to go with him. But in the meantime, my uncle had actually adopted me legally. And that's how I end up with the name Vrancic also. That was his name. We were both adopted, both my brother and I. And so then my uncle said, okay, the child decide what she wants to do. So age 7.
You were to decide?
Yeah, I was to decide where I was going. And I decided, of course, you can just imagine, I've been living with my uncle Ludva, who was a fantastic person, a wonderful person, very kind, and he was all I had at that point, and the same is true for him. He had no family at this point.
Right.
All of his siblings and mother had died, and he had no other relatives, and so this would have been very difficult. But anyway, I made the decision without blinking an eye, and I said, yes, I was staying.
You'll stay.
I was staying. So my uncle left, and he also married and left, and also went to Palestine, to be Israel.
And sometime after the war, I think, soon after the war, you learned that your father had lived at Jasenovac, where he would have been sent, almost until the end of the war.
Yes, actually, practically to the end of the war. And at the end of the war, the Ustaši tried to destroy Jasenovac because it would be
it would be testimony to their cruelty.
Right.
And they tried to and they were trying to kill everybody. So there was a breakout, and my father was among a small group that managed to break out and escape. But unfortunately, after they escaped and they were in some place hiding in the forest, they stumbled onto a German patrol, and all but one person was killed. My father was killed. That one person who managed to survive somehow testified to that. That's how I know that.
When did you find that out?
Many years ago.
Many years ago. So there you are with your uncle in Yugoslavia. It now is a communist country. And you would remain there until in 1957, more than a decade after the end of the war, 12 years. You were able to leave there to attend university. In the time we have left, tell us how you managed to do that, and then what that led to for you.
Well, very quickly before that, in 56, when I was still in high school, 54, I was still in high school, and I went to a very good high school in a close by town. I had correspondence with another brother of my father's who survived, and he survived Bergen-Belsen, and he was on that was a very interesting, for many people might want to look into that. He was on something called the Kastner train, which went to Bergen-Belsen, and out of Bergen-Belsen they were rescued, he and his wife were rescued into Switzerland. So he wrote to me during my childhood. Every once in a while we corresponded.
Your childhood after the war,
of course. Of course, and after the war. And sort of while I was in junior high, I would hear from him sometimes. And then by 54, they asked if I would come and visit. So in 54, which was very unusual for anybody to leave Yugoslavia, it was a communist country, you didn't go to Switzerland. But I was allowed to go because I was labeled a victim of fascism. And as such, I was allowed to go.
That was one of the privileges of being a victim of fascism.
Yeah, victim of fascism. And so I was allowed to go. So I had a passport, and the Swiss gave me a visa after a long time. And I went for the first time, I actually got to see some of my family and in Switzerland. And they had 2 young children, and we got along very well. It was very emotional to find my uncle. The only family that I saw since I was a very young person.
Right.
And but we got along very well, and they said, why don't you come back once you're at the university? And so that's what happened at this point in 1957. In 1957, after I finished my first year of university as an English major, I was going back to Switzerland to study. I thought I was going for a year to study and then come back. I was going to study
And were you allowed
French.
to leave to study also because you were a victim of fascism? Same thing. Okay.
Same thing.
Okay.
And I came back once. Once you come back once, then obviously you are not.
You weren't trying to escape.
You're
Okay.
not trying to escape. So I was given another visa. And I don't know whether we are at the point in which you want me to tell you.
I do, as a matter of fact. Yes, we are at that point.
How I found myself on this train. So I found myself on the train to Switzerland, and it was 1957, fall of 1957, and there were a number of young people in the train, in the hallway of the train. There were 3 gentlemen actually, and they were discussing in English something that was happening in the United States, and it was what was happening in Little Rock, Arkansas. Was Governor Fobb was not allowing African American children to enter high school, and it was seen for what it was all over Europe, and the Europeans, of course, were stunned by much of it, especially in the communist world. They exploited it too.
Right,
You know,
right.
it's such things happening. And so there was one of these three people was a Yugoslav, must have been a communist, because otherwise why would he be going out of the country, and would not be allowed to go.
Right.
And then a gentleman from, there was an Englishman and an American. And the American was being attacked as to what kind of a country is this and what is going on. And he was trying to explain how not everyone in the States feels that way, and how he's sure things will improve, and President Eisenhower was about to send troops to Arkansas and so on. And after that broke up, I was very anxious to continue to get into a conversation, because I had been studying English for all these years, and I had not had the opportunity to speak or listen to people speaking English. And so I took a little trip back and forth, and this gentleman said, something about my pretty red hair. This time my hair came in handy.
And he was not saying, he didn't think you understood though, right?
Yeah, well, he said he didn't know whether I understood or not, but I smiled, and and he said, "Oh, so you understand English?" And so we continued to talk, and we talked about everything under the sun for the next few hours. He was getting off in Venice, which was on the way, and he had just come from, as you mentioned in the introduction, from the postdoctoral study in India. Took a long way home, we parted and we exchanged addresses, and then he wrote, and then I wrote, and then he wrote that he asked me why I was in Switzerland. I explained, and then he told me he was Jewish too, and at that point my aunt got very happy and made me write when I was slow. But anyway, we wrote back and forth, and with greater and greater frequency, and then he came back by mid-August, and we were married in September. And then I came to the States. That's
And
why I came.
Your uncle Ludovic, of course. How did he accept the fact that not only were you marrying this fellow from America, but you were moving to the United States in light of all you've been through?
He acted, as always, as a loving and very gentlemanly person. And I wrote to him that this was happening, that I'd fallen in love and I want to go. And I made great promises. The promise was, he had always, the one thing that he always insisted, well, there were two things. One, I was to finish university, come hell or high water. That was very important. And the other thing is, I needed to always have my musical studies going. And so this time I promised that, yes, I'm getting married, but I promise I'm going to finish university. And he wrote back and said, well, it depends on my uncle with whom I was living in Switzerland. If they think it's a good idea, he will go along. Yeah. And so that's what happened. So unfortunately, he couldn't come for the wedding because I had to get married in Switzerland. I got married, by the way, in an Orthodox Jewish ceremony, but he couldn't come back because because obviously there would have been a difficulty in terms of how to get a visa and so on. Right. But also he had already, his health wasn't great, and he was older already, and so he didn't come. But after I was married, I managed to go with my family twice, and with my husband and the two children, to see him. And so he understood that this was going to be, that this meant a better life for me than if I had returned to Yugoslavia. So.
Dora, thank you so much. As you can see, we probably could have kept you here for a good while longer to hear so much more, not only about what Dora experienced during the war, but also after the war years and building a new life here. We're going to close the program in just a moment. I want to thank all of you for being with us. Remind you that we'll have programs twice a week until the middle of August. So if you can't come back, our programs are, you can view them on the YouTube page, so please do that if you get the opportunity. I'm going to turn back to Dora to close our program in a moment. When she does, two things I'd like to mention. One is that our photographer, Joel, is going to come up on stage, and he'll take a photograph of Dora with you as the background, so please stay for that if you would. And secondly, because there wasn't time for you to ask questions of Dora, Dora doesn't know this yet, but when she's finished, we're going to have Dora go up to the atrium area where you came in and be there to meet you. If you want to ask her a question, please do so, or just say hi or have your photograph taken with her. So we really urge you to do that if you'd like to do that. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person gets the last word. And so with that, I'm going to turn it to Dora to close our program.
First of all, thank you for allowing me to share some thoughts with you. And as you have heard, I've just returned from another camp, that camp of Jakovo. It's a former concentration camp, and I've been told that my mother was there and was killed there. And it's a well-known camp, and one of the reasons that it stands out as a terrible concentration camp is that there were, at one point, 50 children sent there, and from Serbia, actually, and sent there and just killed. And it just it was a very brutal thing that happened. And the fate of those children, and then, of course, thinking of my brother being separated from my mother, were still on my mind when I came home, when I returned just 2 weeks ago. And usually when I come back to the United States, I feel just some sense of relief, you know, I feel I'm home. And this time I wrote down how I felt because I didn't want to say things halfway. So when I came back, my homecoming was marred by the shocking events on our southern border. Young children were being separated from their parents. All my memories flooded back, and all I could say is, and all I could think of was, not here, not in this country. It seems, fortunately, that somehow we are coming to an end of this practice, and hopefully the family will soon be reunited. And I am very grateful that at least some of it testifies that we still have a civil society, and I'm grateful for the many people who spoke up and protested. As a survivor, I find it imperative to join those voices and to ask for a humane treatment for those who seek our help. I hope that a reminder of the cruel past that was the Holocaust may inspire us to see that tolerance, compassion, empathy, and respect for others makes for a better world for all of us. Thank you.